welcome to the deep end. You know, our mission here has been to explore and entertain those things and processes that life cannot do without. Wow. We've tried to offer some ways of wondering about what is really going on here on planet Earth and what's going on with the human family. We've explored some amazing ways the universe came into being and grew and developed within itself into life and eventually to self-awareness. We've looked at how evolution has continued through differentiation, complexification, and semi-permeability. And we've asked over and over, what's next? I'm convinced that the human family are now in an intentionally involved relationship with our own evolution. And what is that next step? We've touched on it a little bit, but I'm convinced at this point that it's justice. Justice. To that end, our human family continually reacts in new ways of government. I should say recasts itself in new ways of governing and reaching for greater fairness. Now, how do we do this? Revolutions. So today I want to assure people that, and for people to get some sense that revolutions are integral to the evolutionary process. Now, mostly revolutions have been forcible. Overthrowing a government or a social order in favor of some new system. We could trace revolutions, and this was an interesting study for me. I want to know how far back the revolutions go. And if you look back, there was a Set rebellion in Egypt by the priests of Horus in 2730 before the Common Era. And there's a dizzying hundreds of revolutions since then. It's just amazing. And in most cases, the revolutions were seeking greater justice than the previous systems offered. We can see this reaching for justice and equality, fundamental fairness, clearly in the West since the 1600s. Now, I have to say part of this podcast was inspired by Fareed Zakaria's new book, Age of Revolutions, Progress and Backlash. And I would definitely recommend this book. It's a little denser than I would have thought, but it delineates this journey from absolute rule of monarchs in the church through the Dutch and French revolutions, which, you know, and the warring ways of Europe when we talk about the French Revolution, through the Industrial Revolution and up to the American Revolution that produced this really amazing modern life we live in. Today I want to discuss how important these mass social changes were and are to our lives, and how, if they can bring greater stability, how they can bring even greater stability while creating chaos at the same time and setting us up for the next step. Now, not all revolutions are violent. Though many are. The Industrial Revolution was not violent, although much of the backlash was, and part of the warring ways of Napoleon and what was going on in French. I mean, the French Revolution, Robespierre, or I can't remember the guy's name, he cut off over 17,000 people's heads with this new invention called the guillotine. Amazing. Today, we're in the middle of a national and global revolution. I should say revolutions. From the economics to globalization, technological advances, and our own sense of identity, we're in a swirling chaos of change and a huge backlash to those changes. This pattern of moving forward and a backlash to that going forward is a pattern that can be seen in many of the historic rebellions over the last 400 years. For every radical advance brings with it a backlash. Now, many of us can see this and are concerned about our own future. Will we step into a new, more just future, or will we succumb to our deeper fears and embrace a past that we project to be better, safer, and more comfortable, at least for those in power? Both governments and personal is how we're experiencing this. And we can see it in the news every day. But to see the patterns of revolution can help us understand what is happening to us today and offers a context for further progressive actions. The question today, as in history, is do we go forward with uncertainty or backwards to a past that some fantasy view of how wonderful it was? Welcome, my friends, to the human family's global revolution. There is a call to change our systems for greater justice, for greater fairness, wholeness, and health for both the planet and our individual lives. And I'm convinced that economic growth, technological innovation, and cultural openness has allowed more people to live better lives, that the revolutions have created and fostered a world that seeks greater fairness. And the main points of a revolution have to do with economics, technology, identity, globalization, and geopolitics. All of these go into how we see ourselves and how we find that what our stability is based on is not going to carry us into the future that is structurally solid. So, with the broad structural changes that are calling us today, what are those? What are those? The two plot lines, it seems to me, are we move forward in progress, growth, disruption, and revolution, or we go backwards to regression, nostalgia, and restriction. And I want people to understand that when we think about going backwards, those views of how wonderful the past was excludes a lot of people from power and prosperity. And that's part of what revolutions have been about. If you look at the Industrial Revolution, it's really clear that, people were struggling. And so they moved from their farms into the cities. The cities became great. They became industries. And of course, we can pin a lot of this on the steam engine. Because, in the Dutch Revolution, one of the big revolutions was the way they changed their land. They pushed back the sea, and they created power systems using windmills. But steam dwarfed that, and the Industrial Revolution took off. And the place that did take off was Great Britain. An amazing, in my study this week, my respect for Great Britain has grown exponentially in terms of what they pulled off and how they pulled it off. So, my friends, I'm here with my cohorts. Mary Ann Rudis is coming to us from Spokane Valley. Bob Hayes from the stormy world of Florida. So my suggestion, and actually my conviction, is that the next step of evolution, once we get through being to life to self-awareness, what is self-awareness doing? It's trying to create a field of justice, of fundamental fairness, of health and wholeness. And, the things like climate change, viruses, disease, all of these things go into it, and how we create a world that is more fair and just. So, my position is, the next step of evolution is justice, and revolutions are a way that keep turning us over to greater structural changes that include more people into prosperity and power, and that the power is no longer in a monarch, it's no longer in a church. And many of the revolutions that occurred in Europe were basically against these two authoritarian consolidations. So, Bob, I'll start with you. What do you say about justice being the next step of evolution and revolutions playing a part of that?
Well, I agree. I think that the abstract concept of justice has been behind virtually all of the revolutions, at least the leaders of the revolution who start off being pretty idealistic, and they're driven by the desire to find more justice for whatever group they're representing, whether it's the farmers or whether it's the lower classes, whether it's the workers, and so forth. And so they are inspired and driven to organize themselves in such a way that they can make their idealistic ideas more likely to happen. And it's kind of interesting when you define something as a revolution, like most everything else in humanity, a lot of it depends on your point of view. The buggy whip manufacturers really didn't like the evolution that was spawned by the invention of the internal combustion engine and the whole idea that there were cars. And suddenly they were on the other side, and then some of this backlash occurs. So to them, that was not a good revolution. Justice wasn't happening to them. So it's always a back and forth. And I think that where we are in our modern world, and these revolutions that are happening, whether it's the iPhone or whether it's satellite communication or whether it's the space race or all of these different things, I think because technology has allowed us to have more of a global meeting place. Interesting that you talk about Fareed's book. His TV show is GPS, the Global Public Square, and we're now able to interact with people all over the world and exchange ideas. So I think that the revolutions that are happening today and moving into the future, although there will be backlashes, it's more likely to be moving toward justice just because we're communicating with each other better.
Marianne?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting topic, and it's there is, for me, in any kind of change that happens to occur in the world, whether it's brought about by technology or by war or by whatever brings it to the forefront, there's a certain amount of our recognizing our own personal power and our own personal participation in these events happening. And, we talked about revolutions bring about change, and there are people that don't want change, or people that have an idealized view of the way things used to be based many times on stories. They may not even have lived it. And but they have this idyllic vision that if we just can go back and halt this change, but you can't go back. And so I think going forward, the other piece of this is we have to join together. People have to, and those with power have to join with those who do not have power and be aligned in able to be able to move things forward. So there have to be allies, I think, and it's, when I think about just the changes I've seen in my lifetime, and just the fact that women could not get credit back in the 60s without a husband, and just that one thing, and we've forgotten that. A lot of women that are grown, right now don't realize that was a hard fought for right, and it was part of a revolution for women's rights. And so I think there has to be some kind of remembrance on how things used to be, but there also has to be a vision for how we want them to be in the future, and we can't do it by ourselves. So we have to join with those who have that same vision and work towards the kind of world that we want to live in.
Amen. And, what we're talking about is structural changes. Go ahead, Bob.
I was just going to say that I think that Marianne made an important point there in referring to the fact that there's always a power exchange in revolutions. And it's very, very difficult to say to someone who's in power, we want you to share your power with these other people. And it's the only way that it's going to work is if that can happen. But how do we motivate someone who has all the power to give some of that up and share it with others? And that's where it's very, very difficult. And that's where the more we can educate each other and the more we can realize that it's really not giving up power, it's redistributing power so that everyone benefits.
And yet, that is the journey since the 1600s. The power that was consolidated in authoritarian ways was the monarchies and the church. And many of the revolutions were against those, and trying to create partnerships. The Magna Carta in England, I don't think I understood how brilliant a document that was in creating, a way for people to share in that power. And that's part of what I mean when I say justice is on the rise, that it is an evolutionary thing. And I don't know where it's going to take us, but I think it'll take us to a better sense of what wholeness is as a planet and what globalization really is about. And, I think, Bob, the internet, you mentioned that in your opening statement. I think those kind of things can bring us together. Yet, we thought that having all that information would be good, and now we're finding out it's not so good. And, someone, I think it was Neil deGrasse Tyson, whatever his name is, Tyson, said it. He said, AI is going to kill the internet because in 10 years you won't know what's real and what's not. So nobody's going to put their faith in anything on the internet. The revolution in our time can break out violently or not. The right wing right now wants a violent revolution. As Steve Bannon said, we can't talk about healing until there has been blood spilled, and there hasn't been any blood spilled yet. This is the backlash of it. People are so, the change in our lives, the three of us, and I'm 70, I think Marianne's in her 60s, Bob's in his 70s. We've lived in the most stable time the planet has ever had. That stability is now breaking up. It's breaking up for a whole lot of reasons. You can look at the geopolitics. You can look at the fact that when we had true hegemony, when the United States did after Russia or the Soviet Union was broken up, we spread democracies everywhere. We had the leading voice. And what's happening now is those democracies that we seeded are starting to fray because they weren't necessarily from the ground up. They were imposed, if you will, because they had great economic consequences. And the economics is everything. When you talk about shared power, when in the Industrial Revolution, when all those farmers moved to the cities in order to work in factories, all of a sudden they had money and some extra money, and they could buy, books. They could buy wine. They could buy cheese. They could buy things that they didn't have to make. There were industries now that were making those. They weren't these small little groups of farmers that were doing cheese or wheat. It was a huge piece. The textiles. We were getting, England was getting all kinds of cotton and linen and silk everywhere, and they created a huge textile industry. just, I'm just amazed at how fast that happened and how quickly the cities grew. And yeah, there's a lot of suffering in those quick growing cities because, squalor, disease, there weren't any toilets. Where did people poop? Well, the whole thing keeps evolving. And I guess I want our listeners to see that revolutions are not necessarily bad. As a matter of fact, they're mostly good. However, the violence piece and the suffering, if we could just avoid that and still move to a new order, if you will, without the violence.
Well, I think the leaders of the revolution also have to be willing to give up their power. And that's where there's been problems in most modern revolutions, going back to the Russian Revolution and so forth. Once they have achieved their initial goal to take away power from whatever authoritarian, whether it was the king or the church or whatever, they suddenly find themselves controlling the power themselves, and then they don't want to give it up. So they become, in some cases, worse than the power that they were revolting against. So that's the danger, it may be part of human nature to, again, have this backlash and so forth. You were talking about how they trying to take power away from the church. Well, now you see in American politics where the evangelical church is turning themselves or sponsoring authoritarian viewpoints to retain their power for certain issues that they think is important. So suddenly we've got the church becoming what we've fought for years to get away from, and that's that authoritarian rule.
Yeah. And it's not just that, because what happens is many of the powers, they don't want to give up the power, and so they consolidate. That's happening in America. If you look at the Supreme Court, it's totally corrupt, and yet it's consolidated power in a very absolute way. They can make up all kinds of reasons for doing what they do. I mean, if you look at the shutting down of Roe versus Wade and pro-choice, they went back to the 1500s and quoted lawyers back then. It's amazing how what power will do. And this is part of what revolution is about. It's to stand up to that power and say, no, the way that we're structured right now with the Supreme Court, and I mean, Biden's talking about adding people to the court, to creating a new structural way of diluting that power so that it's not in the hands of a bunch of authoritarians, which it is now. And I think that it's important for us to understand this pattern, and we've all talked about it here. Moving forward, a backlash against that, trying to bring us back. The conservative movement is there to conserve the stability of the past. The progressive movement is there to take us to new understandings and to entertain new structural possibilities to create greater prosperity for more people, greater diversity, and greater health. I think about, one of the aspects of the global revolution has to do with two things in my mind: climate change and viruses, because neither one of them recognizes our geopolitical boundaries. It's one happening, and it's happening to us all. And even to see some of the backlash against, the science of climate change is a huge piece to me of one of the aspects of this next piece of evolution, which isn't just about justice for me and for people, but it's about eco-justice. And what that means, it has to do with, just like we quit putting lead in our water because we knew it was unhealthy, we quit putting nitrates in our fertilizer because it got into our food and it was messing up the environment. We changed that. The same is true of so many different things. But I will say that it takes a certain amount of tolerance of one's own anxiety in order to face the kinds of changes that are happening, and they're happening really fast. Again, the three of us have experienced the greatest global stability of all time, and we are now experiencing the greatest revolutionary times of all time, because it's not just happening locally. And you can see it in geopolitics. Countries, whether it's Turkey or whether it's the Philippines or whether it's China or Russia or the U.S., they're all trying to regress. There's a force in all those countries to regress, to capture a past that never was. And that's also having an effect on global relationships and how we deal with that. I mean, if we look at the Palestinian problem, talk about, we were united a year ago, and now it's just in all directions. We're in the middle of a revolution. How do we participate in it in such a way that we keep it bloodless, keep the suffering down, and also move forward with greater prosperity for more people?
Well, I think, as you were talking, Bob, the lyric popped into my head, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. And so to answer your question, Red Hawk, how do we do this? And that's where I think we can't change the world with the same mindset that created the world we're in, right? And so if we come to a revolution out of anger and hatred of the other, and we want to move things forward, and yes, maybe in our neck of the woods, we've had great stability, but there has still been places in the world that were in absolute turmoil. And if you were an individual in those places, that statement wouldn't ring true. And so I think that's where that whole idea of raising our own personal consciousness and fortifying ourselves and bringing that into a more just world, rather than being in love with the power. I mean, what's that phrase, when the power of love is greater than the love of power? And making sure that when we choose our leaders, and Bob, you've said this many times, when we choose our leaders, that we make sure we choose leaders that have that kind of a mindset. Right now, we're choosing leaders that are a reflection of this power and control. And so how do we step into this new place? And I think it takes all of us, and it takes us together, but also individually.
And I'm going to let that be your final comment, because it was beautifully said. Bob, final comments?
Well, I think that if we try and remain optimistic, we're going to say all of these different revolutions and backlashes and changes and so forth are ultimately moving us forward toward a more just planet. But we got to realize that it's going to be a long, difficult journey. And we have to remain patient, we have to remain steadfast, and we have to try and be as empathetic as we can to as many people and groups as we can. Because we don't understand where they're coming from most of the time. We're just in our own little bubbles. And if we can expand our own empathy, then perhaps the backlashes will be not quite as effective as they have been in the past.
Yeah. Well, this place in our lives is wrenching to me. I know a lot of people who just, I call it, say, whistling past the graveyard. They don't want to own it. They think if they could just be happy all the time and deal with their own lives, it'll be okay. I'm a realist. I see that we need to find a way to somehow create opportunities for change that are not wrenching. But I want to say chaos, it's inevitable. Now, where do we go from here? I think one of the things that I really like, and I've been wanting to do a podcast on, is innovation. Because innovation has actually caused a lot of the revolutions. We come up with new stuff, whether it's the steam engine or whether it's the internal combustion engine or the telephone or the telegraph or the internet, any of these things. It's just an amazing thing. Innovation. I'm convinced that America has created the most unbelievable, innovative instrument with a partnership of three groups: industry, universities, and government. And if those three can stay in tandem with each other, can stay in a relationship, the innovation has no end to it. And we're seeing it. I mean, there are so many changes upon us right now. This innovation piece, I want to say, it's amazing. And, you want to do some real research, just Google the top 10 defense contractors and the stuff they're working on. Just Google DECA. Is that right? DECA? The government's innovative engine? DARPA, sorry, thank you. My friends, innovate, revolutionize, and move forward into a new world. Until then, until next podcast, blessings on you.